thank you for joining me and hope that you find this an interesting webinar. So an ambitious title, everything you need to know about mosaicism. Hopefully we will cover the key points and everyone finds this, that they leave this webinar more informed. This is obviously an evolving field and we will be going through where we are today. There's a bit of a background. I'm David Crimes. I've been working in the testing of embryos, the genomic testing of embryos since 2008. I'm a molecular biologist, I'm a geneticist, I'm not an embryologist, just to put this talk in the context of the genetics of testing of embryos. So without further ado, let's move on to the webinar. So what we'll be covering today is what is the issue with mosaicism, or what is the perception of the issue with mosaicism. And of course, one of the big questions which keeps being raised in the community is, how do you detect mosaicism? How accurate is the detection of mosaicism? Even if you detect mosaicism, how should it be reported? And should you have it reported? So hopefully by the end of this, we will persuade you that mosaicism can be detected and the reporting of it is important. And we'll be driving that conversation off the latest transfer outcome data, which has been accumulated and continues to be accumulated through many centers and many times. So to just really start with PGT-A or PGS as it used to be known and where we are. So this is the CooperGenomics technology, PGT-A, and this is data that we've been generating on our latest platform, PGT-AI2, and 25,000 embryos tested. Really, what I want to highlight here is that between the euploids and aneuploids, you have 85% of all your embryos coming back with a clearly defined euploid or aneuploid answer. So even with mosaicism, it's a relatively small percentage of embryos which come back with a mosaic score. We at Cooper split those into low level and high level mosaic, and we'll come to the reasons for that shortly. There are two other categories which I'm not going to go into today, but we do have information on, which is no DNA, which is where the biopsy sample is shipped, and unfortunately we can't generate the first stage of the process, the whole genome amplification. That happens in about 0.7% of cases. And a QC fail is where the whole genome amplified product has been run on NGS, and unfortunately the data is unsuitable for interpretation. These should not be considered as failed embryos and lumped into the aneuploid. They have the potential to be rebiopsied. They have the potential to have an answer, which could fall anywhere between the euploid and the aneuploid. But basically, I just wanted to highlight that those are options that may come back on the test report, but it shouldn't be considered as any individual category within the reporting. So really today we're talking about these middle categories of low level and high level mosaic embryos. It is an argument that has been going on for many years. What do we do with mosaics? How do we manage the patients with mosaics? What's the risk around transfer? How can we be sure of the outcomes? There have been many talks around different platforms and whether the frequency of detection is reliable and robust, and how some people may wish to have a reduced detection level to try and minimize difficult conversations with patients. Does it actually matter what the mosaic detection rate is? Because ultimately there's been concerns that by labeling something as mosaic or inaccurately labeling something as mosaic could affect the success rate of IVF, especially if PGT-A is undertaken, and what happens to these embryos that have been labeled as mosaic. So there's been lots of concerns raised around needing to track the success rates and the outcome data of mosaic embryo transfers. And we'll look at some of that data towards the end of the talk. So let's just quickly remind ourselves as to what mosaicism is and the types of mosaic that you may come across. So at the very basic level, PGT-A or PGS as it used to be known was there as a screening test to try and establish if that embryo had the correct number of chromosomes. And the whole concept of PGT-A was born from the knowledge from natural conceptions and testing of products of conception that a lot of miscarriage is driven by an incorrect number of chromosomes. So the logic is if you can test that embryo for the correct number of chromosomes, you stand the highest likelihood of success from that embryo transfer. So this is a normal, healthy embryo with 46 chromosomes. An aneuploid embryo was one which had an incorrect number of chromosomes. In this case, we've highlighted chromosome 10, which is a trisomy. There have been no recorded live births of a fully triploid chromosome 10 person. So if you detect an embryo with a full triploid chromosome 10, the chances of that having a successful outcome are very, very low. And we know that a triploid or an aneuploid embryo will result probably in a failed implantation, a miscarriage, or depending on the abnormality, in a genetic disease. When I started all those years ago, then we were really dealing with these two categories alone. We were doing single cell, it may be a day 3 or a polar body, and you had a very black and white PGT-A screen of euploid or aneuploid. Now the technology in IVF has moved on. We're culturing typically day 5, day 6, even day 7, taking trophectoderm biopsies of multiple cells. We started to detect mosaicism, which in a simple term is the presence of two or more populations of cells with different genotypes in one individual embryo. Now here we're representing the euploid as the green cells and the aneuploid as the blue cells. Now, this is very much a 2D model of an embryo. Now, obviously, when you're taking a biopsy, you're taking a collection of cells and hoping that that biopsy is representative of the entire embryo. So we're talking about 5 cells out of the whole embryo. Now, in reality, and there have been various studies where they've desegregated embryos, and when you have a mosaic embryo, it can really present in 2 ways. You can either have a blastocyst, which is completely mosaic at the trophectoderm and the inner cell mass level, or you can have one which is just mosaic in the trophectoderm. Now, at the time of biopsy, of course, you don't know, and you can't know the state of the inner cell mass. So again, we are talking about this trophectoderm biopsy as hoping to represent the embryo. And depending where you take that biopsy, you may get more cells which are aneuploid or euploid. But what has been shown is that no matter whether it is within the entire embryo or just the trophectoderm, mosaic embryos in the early studies showed that they generally implant less, they miscarry more, but they can lead to a live birth. So what I want to show you is how the correct identification of mosaic embryos into these categories can give a better informed choice for the IVF patients, and we can make better decisions and more informed decisions around embryo transfer. So Mosaicism is largely independent of maternal age. And by that, we mean that any patient of any age, be it an egg donor, all the way through to the more advanced maternal age, have the chance of having a mosaic embryo. So typically, and like when I started off, embryos were either euploid, the green bars, or the blue bars, aneuploid, and you saw the typical charts of increasing age, decreasing euploid rate, and the corresponding increase in aneuploid rate. And then as we got to day 5, day 6, trophectoderm blastocyst biopsy, then we started finding these mosaic embryos. Now, mosaicism is believed to primarily occur as a mitotic event. So these embryos started off as euploid, and then one of the cell divisions has gone wrong and the daughter cells have populated, and you end up with these mosaic embryos. And this is why it appears at some level the chance of having a mosaic embryo decreases with age, and that is just because you have fewer euploid embryos at any given age range that even start euploid to then turn into mosaics. But as a percentage, they stay fairly flat relative to the number of euploids. It's also worth stating that nobody truly knows why these mitotic divisions occur and why these embryos go from being euploid to mosaic. There is still a lot of work to be done on what is driving these embryos to become mosaic. So how do we detect mosaicism, and how does it feed into reporting? Well, from a CooperGenomics perspective, what we have done is spent a lot of time investing in the technology and doing a serial dilution. So you have embryos which are completely aneuploid or are completely euploid. And then you make up a serial dilution of mixing aneuploid with euploid at different levels. And what you can see is the green data in the middle here is basically the data range that we would consider to be euploid, normal, and then as the load of mosaicism increases, you see changes in the data, and you can start seeing a shift in this copy number. This is a schematic of what the data may look like. And this is an example where we've just gone at 15% increments, but in reality, we actually did it at 5% increments and did it many, many times. Now, in terms of reporting, what that means is you have a technical resolution. So this is in a theoretical platform with tightly controlled conditions. The technology is capable of detecting a resolution to even down to 10% mosaicism. In reality, and PGDIS guidelines state that you should biopsy between 5 and 7 cells. So if we think about one cell being abnormal out of 5, that is a 20% mosaicism level. So we have, both based on some early scientific data, but also from the concept of biopsying 5 cells, taken the strategy that anything below 20% mosaic is euploid. Then those which are closest to euploid, so the 20 to 40%, so typically say 1 abnormal cell, these are low-level mosaics. Anything above 40 to 80% fit in the high-level mosaics, and above 80% aneuploid. We do not further subdivide. We do not try and give you an exact percentage on the report. We've put them into these 4 categories of euploid, low-level mosaic, high-level mosaic, or aneuploid. And this is to both aid the interpretation and also to fit with the data as we see it. how do we know that we are accurately detecting mosaicism? I mean, if we're saying it's important, we need to be confident that we can detect it. And that comes down a lot to the technology. This webinar is not really to go through our whole technology platform. There's a link here. Please go and look at the PGT-A2 technology platform. But basically, all I want to touch on here is we do a lot of sequencing now. We do 4 million paired end sequencing reads, and that gives us more data. That more data allows a deeper analysis, which includes, for the first time for a PGT-A platform, SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Now that gives us 2 independent assessments of ploidy and the mosaic status. And that is important. If we're going to subcategorize embryos, let's be sure that we are accurate in our measurements. The other thing that we can do with PGT-A2 is parent of origin testing for meiotic changes. So this is to find out if the aneuploidy is either derived from the maternal or the paternal side, as long as we had the parental cheek swabs, and we can help with validation and detection of all forms of triploidy. But again, if you want to learn more, please look at our PGT-A2 webinar and come back to us with questions. So just to recap our reporting. So from the evidence that we had seen and increasing evidence, we report, and this matches the PGDIS guidelines, in 4 buckets. Less than 20% mosaic are euploid, low level mosaic 20 to 40%, high level mosaic 40 to 80%, and aneuploid 80% or above. Now, there is a caveat to this, and this comes back to the data that we will be presenting in a minute, is that it's the chromosome with the highest level of mosaicism which drives the outcome. So if you have an embryo with 2 chromosomes which are mosaic, say chromosome 1 is a low level mosaic, but chromosome 3 is a high level mosaic, we will consider that embryo to be a high level mosaic. So from a reporting perspective, and when we're thinking about transferring embryos and patient conversation, what we have is ideally embryo 6 at the bottom, euploid, no chromosomes impacted, it's normal, this is your priority transfer. You're then left, you can exclude, or most people would exclude, sample ID 2 and aneuploid, particularly this one, trisomy 18, is abnormal. Then you have the potential of other mosaic outcomes. So in the case of sample ID 1, we have 2 chromosomes which are mosaic, one of which reached the high level mosaic. So we would just interpret that as a high level mosaic, but not tell you which chromosome it was, because it doesn't matter. The outcome won't matter whether it was chromosome 3 that was a high level or a chromosome 5 that was high level. If it's a single chromosome, that's quite easy. We just say what the level is. For us, and from the data that we will come to later, if it's 3 or more changes, it is considered complex. So if you have 3 or more aberrations, it is a complex. And although we list out the chromosomes and the bits affected, they all get lumped into complex, whether it's 3, 4, 5 or more. So that's all very well. We can test it, we can report it. Ultimately, you have a patient decision at the end of this. Do you transfer that embryo? And if you do transfer it, can you manage the patient expectations properly? And what is the likely outcome of a mosaic embryo transfer? So to put it in perspective, one of the big questions which has always been raised around PGT-A is the reliability of the trophectoderm to accurately predict the inner cell mass, effectively the baby, or is just taking 5 cells out of 125, 150 cells, not much better than random chance. Well, what this data clearly shows, so they had some aneuploid embryos by first trophectoderm biopsy. They then, as a research study, desegregated the embryos and found that in the vast majority of cases, if the first biopsy was aneuploid, then the inner cell mass was aneuploid, either with a perfect concordance in the vast majority of cases, or occasionally a different chromosome. But essentially, a very high correlation between first biopsy aneuploid, inner cell mass aneuploid. There was a couple where the trophectoderm was aneuploid, but the inner cell mass was mosaic. That would indicate that perhaps that first biopsy, by chance, found abnormal cells, but there were some normal cells elsewhere in the trophectoderm. Or maybe the inner cell mass had just managed to keep all the normal cells within it and push the abnormal cells out. But that's a very rare event. And there were a few cases where the trophectoderm was aneuploid, but the inner cell mass was euploid. And what it turned out is, in this study at least, where that occurred, these were around segmental changes. So if it's a whole chromosome or multiple chromosomes, it's pretty much guaranteed. If the trophectoderm biopsy was aneuploid, the inner cell mass was aneuploid, really high correlation. Segmental aneuploidy, so these are partial chromosomes, have always been the most tricky thing to analyze. And this is why on our technology, we have minimized data smoothing and we just call segmentals and still report segmentals as mosaic, aneuploid, or euploid. We differentiate that. And there is now data that will be coming to soon to show why that is important. So if you like, that is the testing you can do with research embryos, which tend to be those which are aneuploid, which are donated for research. This is in effect your false negative rate. So this is cases where they've transferred embryos which are euploid and followed them all the way through product conception to also live birth. So they started off with array CGH, and this was published earlier this year, 2020. So with array CGH, then they were getting a very good implantation rate of 63.8%, ongoing pregnancy rate 54%, spontaneous abortion rate 12.5%. However, in rare occasions, there was a miscarriage and they managed to do product of conception testing. And out of all of those transfers, only 2 of the product of conception testing showed anything other than, so this was mosaic result. So basically, out of all those embryo transfers where they could do follow-up, only 2 of them were different to the euploid result for the embryos that they transferred. So that is suggesting that a true euploid transfer, if it results in a pregnancy, is almost certainly a euploid pregnancy. When we move to next-gen sequencing, it is a more sensitive assay. It's more able to differentiate euploid from mosaic. And so by moving to next-gen, some of these low-level mosaics that array CGH could not detect were now being classed as low-level mosaic. So when they then transferred more likely to be true euploids, they saw an implantation rate increase, a decrease in miscarriage, so an increase in the ongoing pregnancy rate, and again, very few discordant results from a product of conception. Again, showing that a euploid trophectoderm biopsy is highly likely to result in a euploid pregnancy. So if you like, this is your false negative. Again, showing how true that trophectoderm biopsy is if it's either black or white, euploid or aneuploid. So what do we do as a community, as a society, with the non-black and white, the mosaic embryos? So this is a study, and really a seminal study published in 2015, where a group started to transfer under full consent mosaic embryos as detected by array CGH. Now, one thing I want to highlight, as I've just mentioned before, by array CGH, only 4% of embryos were detected as being mosaic. So a reduced sensitivity to mosaic load. Nonetheless, they transferred embryos which they considered to be below 50% mosaic, and they had a 33% or a 6 out of 18 ongoing pregnancy rate. That is reduced from what we've seen before at the 69% pregnancy rate, but it's not none. So what this was showing is from this very limited data set that there was the potential for the mosaic embryos to have a healthy live birth. And they actually had the children karyotyped at birth and found that they were, as far as we could tell, a normal karyotype. So the mosaicism seems to at least have been not a factor in affecting, it wasn't carried through to the live birth. It's a very small data set at this point, 18 transfers, 2 biochemical pregnancies which resulted in miscarriage. So not really drawing any conclusions from miscarriage rate, but certainly a much reduced implantation rate and ongoing pregnancy rate compared to euploids. After that was published, many other groups started to track mosaic transfers, although it was still low. And when you do the meta-analysis and bring all this data together, then what they found is an ongoing implantation rate of 37% compared to 77%, a massive reduction, an increase in miscarriage rate from 7 to 25%. So a really reduced ongoing pregnancy rate per retrieval. Now, one thing that is clear from this data is mosaic seemed to have a lower potential, but again, it was not zero. But there was insufficient data here to start to separate out level of mosaicism to outcome for each individual type of mosaicism. And everybody agreed we needed a lot more data on mosaic outcome to really start to delineate between mosaic load and type of mosaics that might be seen. So this is some really exciting data, which we've got courtesy of Santi Monet, that was first presented at the NEAMS conference last month. But this is the largest scale data for mosaicism that has yet been presented. So 822 mosaic transfers. And this level of data is starting to allow us to really pick out the different types of mosaicism and outcome. Now, for this particular data, they've used a 50% cutoff for mosaicism as against our 40%, but what they clearly showed was there is a step change in the outcome depending on the mosaic load for most of these types of mosaicism. So if we look at the segmental mosaic, a partial chromosome, there was 43.9% ongoing pregnancy rate for the low level, and then a 30% for the higher level. Not significant, it could just be the sample size, but definite trend, again, even with the segmental, that the higher the load, the lower the chance of success. And then they looked at single chromosome mosaic, 2 chromosome mosaic, complex chromosome mosaic. And what it showed in every case is the more mosaic load you have, then the worse the outcome. So we really should, and indeed to the point of showing significance. So this was again an indication, even at this level, that really we need to be looking at the amount of mosaicism and how many chromosomes are affected by mosaicism to start counseling patients accordingly so that we can get their proper consent for these transfers. So overall, if we lump all this data together, as I did at the end, we're back at the point where we had in the previous slide, where if you lump all your mosaics together, then you're talking about 36% ongoing pregnancy rate versus a 52, 53% if you transfer euploids. And this is across multiple clinics, and it's multiple patients. So this is looking purely at the mosaic load and nothing to do with any of the other patient underlying conditions. And this is where, by having big data, and we're going to get more and more of this, and I would love the community to come together no matter where they are in the world to really pull all this information and pool it together, is we can start to pull apart the different types of mosaicism and the type of outcome that patient is likely to be able to achieve with any given embryo. So the control group, as we've said, about 57% went on and had an ongoing pregnancy stroke live birth, whereas a high complex, so that is high level mosaicism with 3 or more chromosomes affected, is really low. And then you have these gradings within that which show that a low level segmental, it's actually not as detrimental as some of the other forms. 1 chromosome or 2 chromosome low level, it's not actually that different. But as soon as we get to high chromosome and high level mosaicism, we really do see a big drop off in the pregnancy rate. So I think this is really showing that the level of mosaicism and the type of mosaicism, as we get more data, is going to greatly influence how we manage patients and transfers and the conversations which need to take place with the patients. What do we do as a community? And that's always the big question. So PGDIS came out with a position statement in 2019. It's a 3-page document. I'd obviously recommend everybody read it who hasn't already. But the basic and very basic summary of their work is that they have a primary priority for transfer, which is euploid first, low-level mosaic, followed by high-level mosaic. And again, PGDIS recommend a 20 to 40 and a 40 to 80% thresholding of the embryos. However, there is a secondary priority if you have the option or you want to take it down this path. And I think many people would and some people wouldn't. But the priority is there are certain chromosomes that we know have a higher chance of having a negative outcome. So there are certain chromosomes such as 14 and 15, which have a much higher chance of UPD, uniparental disomy. There are other chromosomes which can affect the placental growth, so you have severe interuterine growth retardation. Again, we've known for many years that chromosome 13, 18, 21 have a risk of a live birth outcome. So you may want to give those a lower priority than, say, a chromosome 10, which, if it is a full trisomy, is not going to result in a live birth. So how you transfer and prioritize embryos based on lots of information is going to be important within a clinic. So the considerations in mosaic transfer are definitely the euploid first, then a low-level mosaic, then a high-level mosaic. Consider the latest evidence. It's always being updated. There's always new papers coming out, and this drives new guidelines to be drawn up from professional bodies like PGDIS. Clearly, there needs to be genetic counselling. This is something that Cooper can help with, CooperGenomics. We have our own in-house genetics counselling that could be offered to these patients, but you do need genetic counselling and they do need to understand the risks associated. No embryo transfer is, of course, risk-free. Every embryo transfer has risk, but particularly with mosaics, should there be an increased recommendation for pregnancy monitoring and birth outcome monitoring, and you know, if it's a standard IVF child which hadn't undergone PGT-A testing, then there is no evidence of an increased risk of a mosaic child compared to a natural conception. But certainly if you're knowingly transferring a mosaic, that may change the conversation. So really, in conclusion, I'm just going to re-go over these numbers just very quickly to say, at least in our hands, you're going to have the majority of your embryos coming back as either euploid or aneuploid, with this kind of 12%, 13% in the middle, which will come back as low level or high level mosaic. So bearing in mind the evidence that I've just gone through and the increasing evidence around how the mosaic load is critical to understand the outcome and the likelihood of a successful outcome, we believe it's important to be able to differentiate accurately the mosaic load within that embryo. Yes, 12% of embryos by our testing show mosaicism. However, if you were to follow the PGDIS guidelines and only transfer those which had not got an increased risk of, say, UPD or live birth, then you're looking at about 6 to 7% of embryos may be more suitable for transfer, even if they're mosaic. Again, as a company, we believe in openness. We report every chromosome we see and the level of mosaicism to allow you and the patients and the clinicians to have an informed choice as to whether or not to transfer that embryo and the risk associated from it. Yes, mosaic embryos have a lower implantation potential than euploids, and they may miscarry more, but they can result in an ongoing pregnancy and therefore should be considered for transfer for some patients in certain situations. And so really this is the conclusion as to where we are with mosaic embryos and transfers. The latest data of the 800 embryo transfers will hopefully be in full publication soon, but the more data we have will drive that conversation, and that will help guide our future discussions on mosaic transfers. So that is the end of the slides. Some questions have come in, which I will now try and answer, but if anybody else has any questions, please type away now. And I will do my best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, we will hopefully be able to get back to you. So do feel free to email us at info@CooperGenomics.com. So first question, is mosaicism due to abnormal mitotic division and aneuploidy due to abnormal meiotic division? The answer to that is, in most cases, we believe that to be the case. So there have been various studies looking at aneuploidy and mosaic embryos, and in almost all cases, mosaic embryos, at least in some cells, contain a full copy of maternal and paternal. So we believe almost all mosaicism is driven by a mitotic error at some point. But we don't know what factors are driving that, whether it's culture, media, patient specific. There's no strong evidence for anything, but it would be a great thing if we could understand what is driving mosaicism to occur in embryos. So I'm just scrolling through some questions. So can we detect mosaicism and aneuploidy during cleavage embryos? Well, at CooperGenomics, we only test currently trophectoderm biopsies. I think have been some studies on a day 3 embryo where you take a cell that's aneuploid, then they've desegregated the embryo cell by cell and shown it to be mosaic. There is a risk if you try and take 2 or 3 embryos from a day 3 that actually, even though it may show mosaicism, you've taken so many cells from the embryo, it would probably have a negative impact just by taking 3 cells to try and find out whether that embryo was mosaic. So from the evidence I've seen, I would not recommend trying to detect mosaicism in a day 2 or a day 3 by an invasive method. Who knows where we may be in the future, but right now I would say that's not really where we are. We're beginning to see cases of recurrent mosaic segmental. So there's a question about recurrent segmental abnormalities. Now, segmental aneuploidy mosaicism, initially it used to be thought that a lot of segmental changes were actually derived from the paternal side, from a sperm, either through fragmentation or breakage of the sperm. And it used to be estimated that 70% of segmental changes were probably derived from the paternal side and 30% maternal. So the question really is if their karyotype is normal, as far as they can tell from a high resolution karyotype, why do they keep seeing the same abnormalities in the embryos? That is a very interesting case. I think it would be something that would be very interested in talking more to you about, and whether that is the resolution of NGS being able to detect these changes, which even though it's high resolution karyotyping is just below their threshold, or whether it is something more fundamental. I'm not entirely sure, but it's certainly something that would be interested in having a more offline conversation with you about, in trying to see what we could do for that patient or those cases. So we don't currently run carrier mapping to define if that embryo is suitable for transfer. We rely exclusively on the NGS and PGTAI2 and just look at the mosaic load. Now, the question as to whether a SNP analysis and maybe looking at maternal and paternal contributions is one that has been published by a few groups looking at mosaic embryos and whether they contain maternal and paternal contributions in some cells. We don't currently run that. We don't think that overall it changes the decisions too much, but again, who knows where we will be in the future in terms of looking at SNP content and maternal and paternal contributions in terms of mosaicism and outcome, but currently that is not something that we look at as a company. So that seems to be all the questions. So I thank you for your attention. As I say, any follow-up questions, please email us at info@coopergenomics.com and we will do our best to answer them. And for wherever you are around the world, enjoy the rest of your day and your evening. So thank you very much.